Skeletal muscle has a high metabolic rate. What that means is that skeletal muscle uses a lot of energy, whether it's resting or contracting, and the form that that energy comes in is in a molecule called ATP. ATP is specifically required to keep calcium inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum using active transport, and ATP is also needed for the detachment of the myosin head group from actin and repositioning that myosin into its high energy conformation. So because muscle needs so much ATP, where are we going to get this ATP? There are three main metabolic pathways that work to produce the ATP that the skeletal muscle is going to need. One of those pathways is the use of creatine. The muscle will also use aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. In this video, I'm just going to look at the role of creatine in ATP production. First, let's take a look at the molecule ATP. It's made up of adenine, ribose. These two pieces are known as adenosine. And then you can see that there's this tail attached that contains three phosphates. ATP adenosine triphosphate basically just describes this molecule, right? Because there are three phosphates that are dangling off of it. And because of that phosphate tail, it's very unfavorable for those phosphates to stay there. And so the way that ATP works is that if you cleave one of the phosphates off of the molecule, that releases energy. Okay, so it releases energy to get rid of this phosphate tail. And what it would leave you with is a free phosphate and adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, the molecule with two phosphates attached. And even that has energy in it, and so the cell could cleave off that distal phosphate, and then what would happen is it would release energy. You can use that energy to do work, and you'd be left with two free phosphates and adenosine monophosphate, or AMP. And so this is the structure of ATP and the way that ATP works. Basically, the cell cleaves off that phosphate tail to release energy to do work. And as far as where does ATP come from in the cell, you might recall there's an organelle that specializes in producing ATP. That organelle is a mitochondrion, and in this picture we can see a skeletal muscle cell filled with myofibrils, and we can see the mitochondria in between the myofibrils. And mitochondria, just like we learned at the start of AP1, is the organelle that produces ATP. We'll take a closer look at the structure of mitochondria in a different video, but here I just want to make the point that in order for mitochondria to make ATP, it's not like it can make ATP, out of the blue, out of nowhere. There are two requirements that mitochondria must have, and the mitochondria has to have a nutrient source. Whether it's glucose or amino acid or fatty acid, you must have a nutrient source. And the other requirement is oxygen. So mitochondria require oxygen. So as long as mitochondria have a nutrient source and a source of oxygen, then mitochondria can produce the molecule ATP, and then ATP is used by the cell as an energy source. So you might be thinking along the lines of, when the muscle cell is at rest, why not use the nutrients and oxygen that's readily available to make ATP, and then we could stockpile this and we'd have a lot of it stored up for when we need it when muscle is contracting. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. We're unable to store ATP. Keep in mind the structure of ATP. ATP has that 3-phosphate tail, and so it doesn't have a long life. It can't be stored, so to speak. But there is a way that you can store the energy from ATP, which is creatine. And so creatine is kind of like the closest that we can get to this idea of storage as possible. Let me show you how that works. Creatine is an organic molecule that we produce in our body, and we also ingest it when we eat meat or a nutritional supplement like this one. Let me show you how this works. Mitochondria make ATP, and we can't store that ATP, but what we can do is an enzyme called creatine kinase can take a phosphate off of ATP add it to the creatine molecule to give us adenosine diphosphate and creatine phosphate. So we just add that phosphate onto creatine. ADP and creatine phosphate are more stable over time, and so the creatine phosphate just holds the phosphate until the muscle goes to work. When the muscle goes to work, what creatine kinase, the same exact enzyme, will just run this reaction in reverse. It will take the phosphate off of creatine phosphate, add that phosphate back to the ADP, giving us creatine and ATP, which can then be utilized as an energy source. So how long will this last? The ATP that is already produced will be used first when we go to work, and then the ATP that's formed from creatine phosphate plus ADP will be used. That will get us through about 16 seconds of activity, which isn't very long. So the minutes to hours that are left are powered by aerobic and anaerobic respiration.